you for Thank you for having me, Jamin. Thrilled to be here.
We played Fiasco the other week. Danny pleasantly invited myself and two others to play Fiasco. It is it's one of these games I read a lot about. I was familiar with it, but it can be hard to find people to play it. For those who are not familiar, it's is a four-person basically storytelling game, kind of modeled after the orchestrated slow motion disasters of like the Coen Brothers films. These sense that you build a plan and then all kind of comes unraveled. I was surprised at how much improvisation. It's like gives improvisational storytelling with structure. You kind of develop these beats and relationships with characters, but the gameplay is like mostly you just like making up stories with your friends with some dice rolling in between. So
it's GM-less, so it's like no one's in control, which is like it's like a Ouija board of a TTR.
right.
So like I think all of our characters ended up with like leg amputations at the end.
Yeah.
Relationships, I forget. I think we were maybe lovers, but might have been your son. I don't know. It got complicated really fast.
It did. It got really extremely out of hand, and there's a lot of table talk. Like it was interesting, like to see how much like crosstalk there was, like kind of like, oh, someone else has an idea like for your character, and you're not bound necessarily to like your own performance of your character, but you can like sort of speak to other people's characters as well. I thought that was like an interesting dynamic. I guess maybe it depends on the table. Maybe some people are a bit more strict about like, no, you need to kind of stick to your own character, but highly recommended.
Yeah, Fiasco is just the best. And I think it does have this like core mechanic, which is just open to anyone's invention. So things do go off the rails, but it's also like you don't have to necessarily inhabit a character. You can describe a scene. Like it's so much bound up with like cinematic vocabulary, which we all typically share those movies. It was such a blast.
I was definitely encouragement, like listening to you in like telling your stories, like how much the skill of like painting a picture in cinematic language that is its own skill, like thinking about the language of film. And we talk a lot about games like we think a lot about games in this filmic capacity, but this really forces you to think in that, like as a game really forces you to think in that way. It's like, okay, how am I structuring the look and trying to paint a picture for everybody else with like film language, like punching in on this character and then we pull out and then we see this, and then like kind of like walking through this budding script that you're developing in real time. It does really encourage that like a filmic point of view, which I really liked a lot. So yeah. Anyway, we'll link to it in the show notes. I'm Jamin Warren with Killscreen. I'm here with Danny Snelson. Do you want to give your one line bio?
Yep. Associate Professor of English and Design Media Arts at UCLA.
Okay. Awesome. Well, we got a bunch of things to get through for today. We're going to talk about Resident Evil, the movie, the trailer, the movie, the trailer, the trailer. We're going to talk about Miles Buckle, who's been inventing games that do not exist on Instagram, and then we'll talk about Danny's project, the little database as well. Lil DB, as it's affectionately known.
I use that informally in email. Right? As like, you come up with a nickname for something you're working on, and it's like the project folder is called Lil DB.
Right. He's a good Southern rap. Feels like Lil DB, Young DB. Those feel like good mid-aughts Southern rap names. Cool. Well, I think to get started, I was reading an archival essay. This was from 2015 from writer Ed Smith, and it was on Resident Evil 2 has this police station in the game, and Ed's piece is about this real building type. It's kind of made in this sort of wrong sort of way. There's a ladder in this police station, and it basically drops down and it presents players with this question. Resident Evil 2, very popular zombie-like game, very popular zombie-like, very popular zombie game. But you're presented with this little detail. There's a main hall and there's this operation switch for an emergency ladder, and the player can like choose to activate it, and it creates this little spatial shortcut between the ground floor and other floors. And so kind of it begged some questions for Ed, which was like, why hasn't it dropped already? Why is the player arriving long? The zombies are already here. Why hasn't, sort of offers these like kind of these individual stories. I returned to that piece I returned to that piece because we did a little news item that did a little bit of numbers on the site that was focused on Zach Cregger's Resident Evil film,
Mhm.
which has been, one of the challenges I think for video game films has been in the past, like how do you translate the language of a beloved film into a beloved game into a filmic like context. It's very
Mhm.
difficult to do from a mechanics standpoint, but one of the ways that it seems like Cregger has dealt with this is that there's little Easter eggs of individual objects, and those objects carry meaning into the film. So in this case, the director has this typewriter. There's a typewriter in the trailer on the desk, and
Okay.
it's sort of betting that 30 years of player fluency will sort of provide the context. So I think Danny, maybe my first question for you is, um, my first question for you is like, how do you see the interplay maybe between like games and film,
Mhm.
this back and forth between like games and film, and maybe how you're seeing it sort of like play. Yeah, tell me a little bit about like your thoughts when approaching like a new film based on a game space.
Yeah, there's so much to say here, and I think I loved the way that you put that in context. The like years of like game training that like lets you recognize that, oh, this typewriter is not just a save point, but it means it's a save point because something dangerous is about to happen. I think there's something interesting about like these vernaculars that get like mapped onto each other. Where of course like so much of video games comes directly out of cinema. And from various like, when you get to a cutscene and like it goes like full cinema mode and you have shot counter shot, you had zoom ins, you have pans, you have all these cinematic techniques that I think can are usually just kind of used in a transparent way. And what I like about this is it like highlights the like artifice of the game within the film. So the typewriter and the shotgun shells you mentioned, I think like for me the triggering thing was like opening drawers.
Yeah,
Or
yeah,
like
yeah.
and you're like opening the drawers manically because like that's the only thing you can typically interact with in these rooms. And and it's usually like randomized. Like there might be some bullet shells, you might have a health pack, you don't quite know what's there. And I feel like that like anxiety about like trying to open something and not being able to find it. It's one of the, that's like a dream logic in some ways, but it's so
Right.
core for video games. And I think like I think that there's something really brilliant about like taking that core kind of like, I don't know, like discovery anxiety and translating it to as a way to like amplify the tension for a cinematic scene.
Yeah, building, those games are like the scarcity is such a big piece of what makes those games like compelling. You have so little ammunition. You're hoarding what you have, dropping things off, leaving them behind. It's just a game that forces scarcity, and the scarcity creates that's what creates the tension. And so I think that would be like a big question is like how much of that active scarcity, because you can see a world where like it's sort of cloying, right? Where like the
Right.
film is sort of like playing with that in a way that feels very like fan servicey. But it does make me wonder about like maybe the mechanics from a storytelling standpoint, how much that will sort of like how faithful Cregger needs to be to this kind of like core thing that animates like Resident Evil, or whether simply putting
Yeah.
the objects is sufficient enough maybe that is sufficient enough to pull people in.
Yeah, and it's like scarcity of objects, but also like an abundance of spaces. I think, I was thinking about that piece from 2015, Ed's piece, and one of the things I found so fascinating about it was thinking about, this thing that like, oh, this police station used to be an art museum, and that's why there's these like whatever secret like hidden corridors. Like he explains away the paintings,
Right, right.
or and it also has like this like bizarre library inside of it. And Cregger has written about how, in the new adaptation he's making, like this is such a core part of video games. It's like you have to have like new visual spaces. So like as
Right.
scarce as the bullets are, the number of environments to keep you playing are like really diverse. And in Resident Evil in particular, you're in a library and that's a vibe. And then all of a sudden, you're in an art museum, and then all of a sudden you're in the sewers, and like you keep moving through these different spaces. And I think there's something like about the mechanics of horror there as well that like, you need like a new space for new surprises and new jump scares, because once you get a type of jump scare, you kind of inure yourself to say like, a four-legged monstrosity crawling at you.
Yeah, yeah. One of the lines in Ed's piece is this idea that horror needs a location that is anatomically correct but tonally wrong.
I love
Um,
that line.
and thinks about that film called. He links to, this is an old video on YouTube that looks at the anatomy, or looks at the architecture of the Shining's Overlook Hotel, and the extent to which this hotel, the hotel it's bound to a physical place, but there are often doors that lead to nowhere, suggestions of escape. There's a sort of a really stunning shot when the boy, I can't remember the main child's name, but when he runs into the maze, there's a map of the maze that's shown as he runs into the maze, but that does not align with like the actual construction of the maze like itself. And so it's a little bit of like, you spend a lot of time like watching The Shining. People really think about that film obviously a lot and like, very deeply.
Yeah.
But that is this kind of, like you're saying, this dream logic that can exist in horror games that is like kind of suggested. Again, will make me wonder, is something maybe I would be thinking about, given what you're saying, the number of locations and the sense of geometry that sort of exists in games, whether that would be something that shows up in the film.
Yeah,
the film
I
as well.
marked that line too, that locations are anatomically correct but tonally wrong. Such a I mean, I love that line. And also that these spaces, in the essay, writes about they're vast and empty, that leave you feeling vulnerable, exposed, and daunted, which is like, like kind of like core, kind of like eerie horror tropes. I was thinking about how the anatomically correct but tonally wrong maps onto Freud. Sorry, not to be that guy. Like, like maps onto like the uncanny, where Freud describes like this moment, like at night, he's disoriented, he's on a train, he wakes up and he sees something that is anatomically correct but tonally wrong, which is actually just himself in a mirror. It's like he's just like frightened himself. And there's like that's like the moment of uncanny where you're like estranged from yourself. You kind of recognize it, but it's like there's something wrong there. And I think that's something that, Resident Evil has always been really good at. And I thought that this piece, I'm so glad you brought it back. This piece by Ed Smith really brings into the foreground.
Yeah. Well, you can read it on Killscreen.com. We'll link to it in the show notes in the archive. It was fun to kind of like lead with that. There was a little bit of kismet in terms of seeing like, what people were interested in and what was in the archive. All right, cool. Moving along. I had a great conversation the other week with a London-based artist named Miles Buckle. Miles was raised in Brighton, was trained in graphic design at Central St. Martin. And he has taken this idea of adaptation. I came across Miles's work just on Instagram. I think just like had seen a couple times. He was doing these adaptations, these video game adaptations. And so instead of turning a game into a film, he pulls cinema, TV, the visual language of media into like 90s video games. So Rear Window is kind of reconstructed as this point and click. Fellini's wonderful film, Amarcord, is redone as kind of an isometric, like Fallout style game. He has moved also into some more like real time-ish animations inside of The Sims. So doing Hitchcock's Rope and then staging that inside The Sims, Twin Peaks, Eraserhead. David Lynch has been he's returned to that quite a bit, but he's rendered that with the polygon count of like kind of like a PS sort of like launch title. And we spent a lot of time talking about this Rear Window set that he had built. He's built the courtyard of Rear Window in Blender from these like architectural blueprints. He's making all of these like quote unquote games, but they are not games that like anyone will actually play. I want to play one clip from my conversation. With him. One second here. Miles was explaining, I was asking him about like, where do you think this impulse like kind of like comes from? Because a lot of people just like go into making video games, right? So it's like, I love video games. I should just like, make video games. And he's like, I don't have any interest in making video games.
I think originally it stems, maybe originally it stems from like things like Lego and sort of choosing to create something that you've not been instructed to create, and sort of
right
always from young age I quite was interested in like trying to replicate things I'd seen somewhere else. So like for instance, rebuilding something without the instructions.
He kind of like points at the Lego. I guess this is like an archival question for you, Danny. I was curious about this idea of like transmuting one medium into another. Do you see Lego as maybe being a place where that impulse maybe starts? Have you seen maybe amongst your students or from yourself this idea of transmuting or moving kind of one medium into another medium? Have you seen that maybe play out in your own work or amongst your students? Where do you think that impulse kind of like starts from before we dive deeper into Miles's work?
Yeah, great. That's such a great opening question. Yeah, and I like, he describes, moving from, say, Legos into voxels in Minecraft. And I think that there's like a really direct line in terms of like building worlds. I was a big Lego kid, and I was like obsessed with building, instead of like building like towers, which I think is what you're supposed to do with Legos, I was like obsessed with building like the longest wall and put Pete with like two Legos tall and would like wrap all around the house. And I think that there is something kind of like, that style of game, I think we've seen as a trend as well. It's why, Minecraft remains so pervasive. Why the kind of like open sandbox games that people are constantly building and playing in Roblox are just so popular. Is that there's like this kind of like freedom and openness to build these kinds of spaces. And I think that there's and of course, like, what's the first thing you want to do when you're in Roblox is like you want to replicate a scene from a film or
Right.
replicate
Right.
some kind of like cultural trope. And so I think that there's something like inherent about, and that's kind of like, that's how painters train, right? Like you like study the masters, you go to the museum and you like try to mimic Picasso. And so I wonder if there's like something like similar for game design that like, what does it mean to like mimic the kind of like, and I think in Miles's aesthetics, like the kind of like blocky, like PS1 era environments that still like retain their like Lego-ness. Like you can see the like the shapes, even though he's building it in Blender and could make like, I think, very sophisticated 3D environments. It's actually maybe more of a challenge to demake those sophisticated environments into something that looks like it comes from an earlier programming era. But I think that like earlier programming era is like, you can see the shapes, I guess you can see the polygons. And I think that there's something about that like reveals the mechanics of building. Like you
Yeah.
can see these are like the Lego blocks that are stacked together. And for me, like I'm always on the hunt for those moments where like a lot of this media tries to get us to forget the artifice of its creation. And there's something about like a demake where it's like, oh, you like it's all artifice. You like it glitches out. You're aware you're looking at a 3D asset. You're not like becoming absorbed into the fictive world. And I love those, personally, I love those moments of breakage, but I think that there's something that Miles is doing that's really interesting that like produces breakage in both directions. So kind of breaking those films to think about how gamey they are.
Yeah.
And then like, breaking the kind of like gamic illusion of like proprioceptive connection to something that's like far more artificial.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, it's a good seg. Here I have another question for Miles. I asked him about his work has a that PS1 era graphics, but it has this sort of like image sort of stretched over a polygon like look and feel to it. And I was curious about this like JPEG face. I think that's what one of the things we talked about here. Yeah,
Great.
I think that I just found that there's such when I was combining, especially like you mentioned with like Fallout, even combining like a specific game, every time it just worked. Like in the when you look back at that sort of graphics from say like the late 90s, and it looks really surreal when you've got a low polygon head, but then they've got a JPEG of like a face stretched over it. So they've decided like, oh no, like we can have the real face of the actor or whoever, and also then the modern context of like people say, oh, when I saw this at the time, this looked really realistic, like, and then now it's like laughably bad, like how it looks. But I'm definitely interested in intentionally like exploiting those aspects of graphics, like computer graphics and stuff, in a way that I think feels very like Lynchian. I hate to use that term, but like feels very surreal because you've kind of all you've done is like returned to a different point in time.
We were talking about the uncanny like earlier. I think that maybe gets at there's this juxtaposition certainly between the thing that seemed real at the time and our sort of contemporary context, 30 years on, of like what computers can actually do. He's sort of like closing the loop. He's like, okay, I can play with the expectation that you have of what a real thing looks like, and I can subvert that like in kind of a unique way. Again, it's like playing back to the idea of like things being like anatomically correct, but like tonally wrong. Like these bodies are also in that way, they're very much that way. So it was interesting to hear him think about this kind of like stretched, if you took a face and then you stretched it over, that would create this like very unsettling move, and it's something that's like worth exploring. And it's also interesting in the sense that like there are certain directors for whom they are working on that register, and so that's maybe what translates it really well. Because it was interesting seeing like for different films, he was deciding to have like different like looks and feels for Hitchcock and for for Rear Window, and then also for Lynch's stuff. Like that sense of unsettlingness seems to work really well in a way that maybe it wouldn't work with like if you chose like a different director. So it was interesting to hear him kind of like walk through that process.
Yeah, I think it fits into all these discourses about like, haunted media, or, when you see these like nostalgia, like older media, like there's something like evil, like there's something lurking in the pixels, which feels like a very Lynchian thing. Just this morning, I was looking through his Instagram, and he posted the final scene with Norma Desmond from Sunset Boulevard, which is like, Norma Desmond having
the smudgy lens, and
right, perfect. And it ends with that line, like, I'm ready for my close up, and it like zooms into this like blur, and like, oh my God, that's like, pitch perfect. And like, but it's also just like so hilarious to imagine like a Sunset Boulevard video game.
Right.
Like, like the rich tradition of like adaptations like E.T. famously, or like the Matrix games, or I don't know, like Avatar just came out. But like to have this like demake as though, these games were made in like this era, I think is Eraserhead's really convincing this way. It's like thinking about like a PS1 era game being released alongside the like, that's like contemporaneous, I guess, with the release of the film itself, and what that, what that surfaces, again, what that like what kind of mutual illumination comes out of putting those things in dialogue with each other.
Yeah, I mean, it is like a suggestion, right? Like there is sort of a suggestion that these would have been things that would have been released like at that time. It's kind of this like what if quality to it. Like what if that's what video game, what if there was a contemporaneous video game release alongside of these films? The other side of it though is, and we got into this a little bit, was, games don't really adapt media that's not, comic books, or they really don't. I mean, there have been kind of these plays over the last like 50 years to try to, dating back all the way back to, the ill-fated E.T. release, where, E.T. was made for the Atari alongside of Steven Spielberg's E.T., and it was rushed, and the game is buggy and terrible, and ended up getting shipped to like landfills, and maybe that kind of like set adaptation off in the wrong foot. But one of the things I did like about looking at Miles's work is I'm kind of like, one of the things that he hears from people like in comments, or like, where can I play this? Can I play this? Like there's this sense that like, if you love these films, like you would want to play them in some way. And that doesn't diminish the work in some way. It may as a question I kick back to you, like why haven't we seen that level of adaptation? I mean, Odyssey is like the biggest film on planet right now. Like, there's so much space to make adaptations in games, and it's not a big budget thing. Like you don't see independent folks like doing adaptations either. So I was curious about like why you think that might be. Why you think that might be?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I wonder if it's, I think there's maybe a to be quite sincere, like a chilling effect from copyright fears for a lot of these. Like, there are a lot of games that are released. That there's the Jurassic Park game a friend of mine, was working on the new. I mean, there are all these adaptations like Avatar, and some of them work better than others. Like a lot of them end up failing. But I don't know, Wolverine is the big game that just came out. All all of the Marvel games get adapted, and it's part of these like transmedia empires. So. But also like the IP, the cultural IP is very locked down. And so I think there might be something about that, though of course I would imagine, any video game would be fair use, but it is curious that there's not more of this kind of work. But I do imagine that there's more of this work that could exist. Like, I think that's one of the things that's magical about Miles's practice is like you watch these clips and you can imagine what it would be like to play, the entirety of Eraserhead inside of Fallout 1. And I think, those kinds of mod packs do exist. I think like in the modding communities, there's lots of these like weird crossovers where someone will, mod Elden Ring to be able to play, a completely different kind of like fantastical scenario.
Yeah.
I
mean, I think some of it may have to do with just the nature of agency, and, becomes this, game players want to, what makes games work is their agential qualities. And once you release that, then it's like, what is it that you are adapting in the first place? If it's so like open, if it's like so open ended. Yeah, I mean, I understand the IP side of things, but there's even, there's hundreds of years, thousands of years of other things that are very much in the public domain. And again, the
Oh, for
Odyssey thing is like a
adaptation.
great example.
And
Yeah,
I
I
think you have to
mean,
do, I
yeah,
think that there's like this like really interesting thing where you have to like surface the mechanics from the
yeah,
film, the mechanics meaningful. Right, like a good game is like this like fusion of like mechanic and narrative. I think the problem with so many adaptations is that the mechanics take a second seat to the
right,
a deep back seat often to the narrative, and that's part of what I think like is so great about Miles is like working with the catalog of David Lynch and Alfred Hitchcock, for example. That those films are all like intricate machines that operate according to like game logics. Like
right.
Rear Window is like a kind of surveillance game where you're
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
the film or like, for 39 steps, right? Like that's like these kinds of like these games of like mystery games. I'm thinking of like The Curse of the Golden Idol, like that you could see that almost as like a Hitchcock film or
Right.
something, right? Like and so I think there's this like overlapping way in which like by even just like suggestively producing these kinds of speculative like gamified demakes of these films that like Miles is like opening the fact that like, oh, like here are the like it for me it forces me to think like, oh yeah, what are the game logics inherent to Eraserhead? And so, like just by
Right.
like putting those two things together, you kind of see it. But I guess it's hard to say like, how like if you did a full adaptation of Eraserhead, the game, like could you play that for 30 hours? Could you like you might that magic only, can exist for so long, I guess, unless there's like something else drawing you in.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it is an interesting question. Yeah, interesting question. I think one last thing with Miles, we talked about. I mean, one of the things one of my favorite, and unfortunately one of his least popular makes is Fellini's Amarcord. That is
Yeah.
a 1973, comedy drama film. It's semi autobiographical. It's a semi autobiographical. It's it's set in this place that's sort of based on Fellini's childhood. But it's also like it's an ensemble film. It kind of goes between all of these different characters. And one of the main characters, find her name. It is yes, okay. One of the main characters is Gradiska, who's a hairdresser in the film. She's the love object for all the characters in the town. She's also, if you've seen the film poster for Amarcord, dressed dashingly in this like this red attire, really striking. And kind of serves as like a spiritual spine for the film, kind of like probably one of the main connective like tissues for the film. One of the Miles's approach to Amarcord as a film, sorry, as a game is, thinking about the game logics, is like walking is such a central feature like in that film. The characters are often walking. There's that great like fascist kind of proto-fascist shot where they're walking through the streets like
Yeah.
with these sort of like fake Mussolini stage. There's so much like ambulation in the film. So I asked him about Amarcord, and what maybe made that one different maybe from some of the others. I want to play that clip real quick.
And like, there's a really great scene in Amarcord where they're all on the water on these little boats, and the sea is clearly made of like plastic or something. But it's like it's not bad special effects. He remembers being in a boat in his childhood, and the sea just being this kind of waterproof layer between him and under the water. And I kind of liked how a lot of video games really have that same thing where like I was saying before, when you look back and you think, oh, I remember Tomb Raider had really good graphics, and now I'm looking at it and it doesn't. I feel there's video games have those same qualities where we remember something in a certain way.
What's interesting about games at this stage in their development is that we now we have like a nostalgic attachment to them. Like we can remember in the past, like you have a childhood that you remember playing games. It was such a new and novel medium that was being created in real time. And now, 50 years on, you can have a memory of a thing that does not match the actual existence of the thing. And that is what like Fellini is like playing with the, basically plastic over the water, is this memory of, for him, like what the water is like, as opposed to the reality of what water actually is. And so maybe it's just like a sign of like games maturity. It's just like, you now have this generational quality to it that we can remember. We have an idea of what a game used to be like from our childhood, whether that's the 80s or the 90s or whatever it might be. And that has actually diverged. It's not realistic. It's not realistic in that way. But in our memory, we remember the feeling, the sense memory of sitting with something. And that's something, it's not unique to games, but maybe it is a sign that like Miles's practice is reflective of the fact that we have a generational quality to games now that it was not possible maybe to make that. There would have been expectation, right? If you did this 30 or 40 years ago, or 30 years ago in games, the expectation would have been to make it as realistically as possible with the things that you have, as opposed to maybe deliberately moving in the opposite direction.
Yeah, and it's like, media aging in that way. Like that there's something, that's part of what makes, I think, these like the defamiliarizing gesture of doing these kinds of demakes. Like when you go back to PS1 era graphics now, it's like, oh my God, look at these like blocky little creatures. But like when I played, when Mario 64 came out on Nintendo 64, like that water felt like water to me.
Right.
Who is it? Scott Richmond writes about this in Cinema's Bodily Illusions, what he calls proprioceptive aesthetics. So he's also thinking, actually, in that book I was thinking a lot about during this interview. He's thinking about like Hitchcock and Lynch. These like moments when you're like falling or like spiraling, and they're often like in Hitchcock these kinds of like over the top artifice that you feel like you're falling. And so I think there's something about games which are so built on these like proprioceptive aesthetic environments where like even though like Mario's water didn't look like real water, like it felt like water to me because I was Mario in that world. I think, Pippin Barr brings this up the best. I'm sure you've seen his museum of different water textures. It's this amazing. It's like a full gallery. I'll send a link. It's like a full gallery, and he's just sampled the water texture from different games. And some of them look like Amarcord plastic, but they are that is like that game's water. Water, like fire, is often used as a kind of like litmus test for how good your 3D graphics are.
Right.
But like when you're in those games, all of those bits of water are just water. And it's only when you get to step back and get them like rescreened. So like something about like seeing Norma Desmond's face pixelated and stretched over a 3D asset in my Instagram window is like, yeah, this is like a weird artifact. Like this, like the like, I'm not going to be absorbed into feeling like I'm actually watching Norma Desmond perform.
Yeah.
So I think that's like, something to do with like time and memory. But I love this piece. And I think like this is part of that way in which like cinema can like this like mutually illuminating capacity that cinema and games can have. I think, talking about Resident Evil or talking about, Miles's work, there's this like way in which like those processes of adaptation end up revealing all of these dimensions that might otherwise kind of lie latent in the different kinds of genres.
Yeah. Well, the whole interview with Miles available on the website. We'll link to it in the description. I had a great time talking to him and keeping up with his work. All right, last bit for today. Let's talk about little database. The little database. Danny, can you tell us a little bit about that project? It's got a wonderful website. Opens like this computer that doesn't belong to you. This desktop website, it's got with icons. You click through and has access to all of these different archives. Tell me a little bit about this project for you, and being the person that you are, I know that you will connect it to the way that you think about games. But yeah, Tell me a little bit about Little Database and the Little Database, excuse me, and the history of this project and how it figures into like your larger game making and media practice.
Yeah, no pressure. That's a very small.
No
question.
Pressure. Yeah.
No, it's one of those things. I've been working on this project for over a decade, and in some ways back 2 decades, where I've worked mostly as an online archivist for avant-garde and experimental media for a series of websites. So starting with Eclipse, which is a collection of like radical small press magazines from the last quarter century. UbuWeb, which is this kind of sprawling repository for the avant-garde. Pen Sound, where we have recordings of experimental poetry. And I've always felt like it's kind of game-like. Like experimental literature is like, obsessed with rules. So conceptualism going all the way back to Dadaism, like 20th century and into the 21st century, I think, so much of experimental poetry and writing is about like developing like rules and constraints and like, other kinds of like strictures that actually rhyme quite a bit with games, but come out of like a very different poetic tradition. Like you can think of like the sonnet is a game form. Like it's like, it just happens to be like a really normalized one. So writers who invent, ways of writing novels without using the letter E, for example. So that was my background. So I've been working as an online archivist with experimental media, and I've been working on these sites. And so the little database was a kind of academic study to write about these websites, but also to play them in their own terms. So it's a standard academic book. It's free and online and open access through the University of Minnesota Press. But I think the interesting thing about the book for our conversation is that it also contains these creative interludes, these media poetics that take the same like kind of traditional academic arguments about how file formats transform historical works of art and literature. It's kind of like the core argument that I'm thinking about is like how, like, I grew up in rural Utah, and it's like, you don't get to see a brackage film on celluloid in Utah. You might be able to find it on YouTube, but the YouTube one's really shitty. It's like, that YouTube thing was kind of meaningful for me. It's like the only way I could interact with it. And so it's like, how do you take the things that we encounter online seriously in their artifactual nature? And part of why I love Miles's work so much, like when you see a blocky PS1 figure, like you really see the 3D graphics, whereas like graphics always recede into the background and become invisible. So at any rate, I'm playing through building these archives, and then created these various kinds of remixes. So allowing a theoretical archive to theorize itself, or if I'm writing about sound, to make a sound remix. If I'm making a video, I made like a video remix. But academic books are small things. Like they're big. Like it's only 200 pages is pretty short, and so I only got to write about these 4 websites I work for. And I've always thought, well, I want this book to be, basically like a rule set or a kind of guide for other people to play with other data sets in similar ways. So launching this desktop directory was really just a way to point to, right now there's 44 websites, but I think I'll just keep growing it to point for like other places where like, there might be small collections of these like interesting digital archives that have been transformed that people can use the methods or the tactics or the poetics from my book to study I don't know, Vim's Lair, like the, like amazing collection of like retro game ROMs or emulators. And really, I think moving from the working on the historical avant-garde and experimental literature into games in my current work, there's I think a through line with this question of play and playful interpretation, and how our everyday media, the digital media that we find ourselves these little devices that we carry everywhere that are transforming our culture, like how can we play them and how can we, like, by playing them, understand them better? That was a long answer, but it was a long answer to a big question.
I'm sure it's like picking children, but do you have a favorite database? Or like what? Yeah, I mean, maybe what for you feels like the deepest cut database that you current you have, like a real get, and then maybe one that is like an unexpected thing to have a database in the first place.
Yeah, it's also like there's I feel like there's like questions of like privacy and availability where like some of my favorite databases are like, in what we call the dark forests that are maybe like a little less legitimate, that skirt copyright law in different ways. And so it's almost like I almost don't want to name some of them.
I see. Yeah.
But there are public databases. I think Text Files is one that I always return to. An amazing collection of early ASCII art from the demo and Juarez scenes from the 90s of the internet, and before. I find like endless inspiration from that site. And there's a whole range of these like odd collections. I think it's also a style of building websites that's kind of died out. Like we think of the internet used to be this like open, playful space where everyone would build their own websites, their amateur archivists. I was very, heavily involved in the kind of Charity blog, like the music blog scene, where I was like ripping rare noise albums and then posting them to a blogspot. And that felt like this, like the internet used to feel more like a video game, I think.
Right.
Yeah. Those current, they still exist. Like anyone can still, like you can build a NeoCities website, in a day. And I think a lot of young web developers are really interested in those kinds of like web revival, early internet aesthetics for that reason, because there was a moment where we weren't all just living in filter bubbles. And so in some way, I think all of my favorite sites are the ones that get me out of my filter bubble and like encounter like raw, amateur, beautifully produced work. For example, the 1 terabyte of data from the Kilobyte Age, which is this amazing collection of like GIFs and Geocities websites that have otherwise kind of disappeared. but like just through exploring them, I feel like much like I get the same pleasure I get when opening a new horizon in a big open world video game, where
Right. Yeah.
like actually like open your horizons and show you things you wouldn't have found otherwise.
Yeah. Did you say Geocities? Is that how it's pronounced?
Like Geocities, I feel like I go back and forth. Is it Geocities?
Geocities. Well, I would say Geocities feels more organic. Like it does. Geo doesn't like split up like GeoCities as opposed to like forming a new thing, a Geocities. That is it never occurred to me to pronounce it that way. I like it. It's not like in the GIF category of thing, but I think it's
Right.
like it's,
Choose decoders, choose GIF.
yeah. What is what is special? Well, I guess there's two thoughts here. I mean, one is and I'm thinking about like our interactions with databases now is moving to these like AI mediated ones, and so it's become even more obscure and opaque. It's just in there somewhere, whereas like your databases that you're highlighting do force a type of um uh uh a creative labor. Like you have to make some choices about where you go and what you see, and oh, you click on something and it takes you somewhere else, and it's a real active thing as opposed to like a text box where you just ask and then it does its own thing. And even if the information is generally like correct, you do lose that sense of like opening the hood a little bit and like sort of working your way through it. It doesn't have that like kind of doesn't have necessarily, it's a different type of serendipity because you're kind of like turning it over to the machine to make some choices. I'm surprised by AI when I use it. But it is different from like kind of like thumbing through the pages or like, literally going through it. Can you tell me a little bit about like how these sort of databases sit in terms of like how we interact with information and where maybe we will be going with information going forward?
Yeah, that's such a thoughtful question. I was using the term little in a few different directions. So think about the Little magazine and the history of these, these collections that this was like the vehicle for the historical avant-gardes that would have, like these websites that were kind of like I'm calling them websites, these little periodical magazines that function kind of like websites, that would have regular features, like different heterogeneous materials that fit together. So I was like, oh, that's a really interesting way to think about digital culture. On the other side, yeah, the little database has explicitly positioning against things like large language models.
Right.
So against these kinds of like dominant forms of computation that bring all of culture into this like massive, like unknowing collection of things, that these little databases, these small collections are like too idiosyncratic. They're like too weird. They've got too many outliers that if you tried to put them all together, it just wouldn't give you any sense of what the materials actually are. And so they resist, I think, certain kinds of like analytic impulses. I think those resistances are like interesting and like really illuminating. A lot of the project that I think is portable is thinking about how our digital media transforms our cultural objects. And that's why I look at what media reflexive or media specific works. One example I always turn to is Paul Sharits' film Dots, this amazing avant-garde film from the 60s. There was like a flicker film that you could see in celluloid, and it would give you seizures. Like like it had to have like a seizure warning. So like the structure of the film it was just like a blank film that he like punched holes into, and like every frame has like all of these holes. And so it's like I've seen it once at like Anthology Film Archives, which is one of the only places in the world you can see it, and it's like transcendent. It's like cinema is like streaming into your eyes, and like you start to hallucinate colors as these like dots are like. So it's like, okay, that's like what it was supposed to be. But when you get dots on fucking YouTube, like the dots, like because Flash video is really bad at quick transitions, it's all built for continuous movement. The dots literally turn into squares. It's just like a blotchy field. The whole meaning making system of that gets turned on its head. But like as it gets turned on its head, dots, now squares, actually reveals to me like things that are otherwise invisible. This is to get back to your question. Like Flash video is really hard to see because it tries to render itself invisible. Like it tries to, give the most accurate representation of a field. And usually that's movement across the screen. It's not like flicker films. So like when it's presented this like flicker film, which is built like its meaning making system is all about its original materiality. Once it gets transformed into a digital object, it like one, you can kind of like understand its original materiality in a new way. And two, like you can actually like, I feel like when I'm watching Dots as a YouTube video, I can see YouTube in a way that I can't see it otherwise.
Right.
So that's I think one of like the core ways in which the book helps to decode digital culture and offer ways of seeing what we're actually seeing when we're looking at these digital systems online.
Yeah. The one other thing I would add is, there's a real diversity in terms of like the look and feel, and I think about the tools that we have right now that really flatten, at least from a UI or graphical interface or from a visual quality, it really flattens the information in a way that these databases, because they're smaller and they're focused, like they don't necessarily. That was one of the things that jumped out at me in terms of like clicking around these different databases is, they do look very different. Can you tell me a little bit about like what size and scale, maybe what doors that opens for a database that maybe, working with I don't know, Gemini, or I mean even Wikipedia, but at this point, or Instagram or whatever it might be,
Yeah.
does not allow that same type of flexibility. What is it about like smaller databases that allows that type of I don't know, that allows for that specific form of creativity?
Yeah, I think like these, instead of like a million books or, like all of the internet or like all of Reddit, which is what's built these large, that's what builds the large language models. The little databases, like they're not always really little, like, but they're usually like handmade or
Right.
they're idiosyncratic in some kind of way. And I think this also like is part of the lineage of the little magazine where, we call them little magazines, but these are magazines that would run for decades over, hundreds or thousands of issues. Each of those issues has like dozens of like weird things. They didn't necessarily have to fit together. Kind of like our podcast. Like there's no specific reason why we're talking about, Resident Evil alongside wait, what have we been talking about? Miles Buckle, talking about like, a piece written in 2015 and then My Little Database book. Like this is a kind of like it's like a chance encounter in time, right? It's like a time-based period, or we call them periodicals. Like it's like this like moment where you get this constellation of different things. And like, there's mutually illuminating effects that happen when you put together these idiosyncratic elements. And so a lot of these websites, I've been looking at and I've been working on building. So I'm thinking about like the back end, the infrastructural level, the like public presentation, the transformation of the files. Like, it's all impossibly complex. Like there's just like so much going on in these little databases. But what I love about them is that they are handmade. They're like, you can see an editor behind it. Like you can see a person who's picking things instead of just the, I don't know, massive vacuum hoovers that are the large language models that are like, as you've seen in the news the last couple of weeks, like buying up all the world's rare books to scan them in and then destroy them afterwards. They're just kind of like, they're just like eating culture. And I feel like that there's something that I find really beautiful about amateur archiving and these like small collections where it's like, some guy in the Midwest is like obsessed with, I don't know, like rare sci-fi periodicals from the 50s and just like scans them in, collects them obsessively. Like I love that kind of like amateur archivist. And for so much of the early internet, like those amateur archivists really kind of built the knowledge culture that again, like all those sites have also been sucked up by the large language models. So there's like a trace of them in there. And I'm kind of interested, like, how do we resurface those traces? And how do we like, I don't know, rebuild or build on top of, or alternatively build an internet that is more game-like, that's more playful, that's more idiosyncratic and surprising, I guess.
I enjoyed the malware museum. That was a little collection, a little collection of terrible things that like rogues gallery of these little things that have ruined people's lives in some shape or fashion. I had a friend who wanted to keep a computer and load it with malware, kind of as unconnected from the internet. It was kind of like a little fish tank. Like you want to preserve these things in a machine, but you kind of need to like sequester them or quarantine them. I think malware is kind of is a funny. We don't really have. I feel like we don't have like fun malware anymore. We just have like phishing scams and like like synthetic voices, people stealing your voice. Like, it used to be these scams. They used to be fun, and they'd have fun names, and it would be in the news about like whatever the new malware. Now it's just like, people are just stealing your identity and whatnot.
Which I love those. I think the best demonstration of what you're saying, Jamin, are the cards and Inscription, where a number of the cards that you play in the video game Inscription are based on like historical, like Elk Cloner is like a famous one, but like these like Elk Cloner is such an insane idea for like a virus, and to bring that into like the like real kind of like play space. I think that there's something like similar where like all these works, and I think the demakes we were just talking about, that like take these bits of like culture and then like put them into like some kind of like weird digital vessel where you can see both things more clearly. I think that's what I'm usually looking for in these small collections.
Yeah.
But I'm glad that the malware one stands out. I think that's like a great. And I think part of building this desktop directory was just to like find things that I really love that people might not otherwise encounter.
Right.
The POC Zine project I think is amazing. Paul Sharits's queer archive work is phenomenal. The Invisible Histories project. There's like a whole range of these things where we also just like live in our filter bubbles, like where we get what our social media gives us typically, and
Right.
and people don't surf anymore. Like you're not like out there just like randomly surfing the web to see what cool shit you can find. But I think it'd be nice if we could do more surfing.
I think that is I think that makes a ton of sense. And yeah, I feel like that has been my relationship to social media, has sort of like changed in that sense, where I feel like the just because it's so stochastic at this point, and now it's just getting flooded with so much synthetic media. And I don't know, maybe that is a thing that we'll be moving back towards. It's just like clicking on a website, kind of just like seeing what you see, I don't know, there might be something kind of nice about getting back to just like floating around and clicking on things and moving through the internet. That's my hope. That is certainly my hope anyway.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we got a couple quick hits, just a couple things to kind of close us out. Could be a lightning round. If there was like a lightning sound that we could play, that's fine. A couple things I came across. They're not all necessarily like new. One is Mitch Anzuoni. I had the pleasure of hearing him speak actually at Demo Festival. He's building a money laundering simulator.
I love Mitch's work. Have you played Small Press Tycoon?
I have not played it, but I've seen it. Yeah, you play as
coming out of like experimental literature, like the fact that somebody made a Small Press Tycoon with like all the stresses of like small presses are just money sink. Like you can't make money. So it's kind of like the worst possible tycoon game. It is perfect. I really love Mitch's whole practice. But sorry, you're going to say.
Yeah, no. I mean, offshore seems like he spoke about this at Demo Festival, and it's been interesting to see like the development of the game, money laundering as a concept. So he's been thinking about like he was talking a lot about like how do you like it's a real thing. Like it's interesting to use like the system of the thing, which is like laundering money, which is real. But it does have this like social critique like kind of like baked into it. In the same way that like with Small Press Tycoon, it's the same thing. It's like you can't make money, and you're sort of questioning the systems, like why do we live in an ecosystem which people cannot make money doing the things that they love. And with money laundering, it's kind of the opposite. It's like oh my gosh, it's like so easy to like hide, like to sort of like hide money. It's like it's shockingly easy. It is also a good example, I think, of an artist also moving into a vein that has a lot of like as a commercial potential, because there are so many of these like deep systems games, Satisfactory, these types of like optimization type games. And it'll be interesting to see if that game maybe triggers a little bit of I don't know if it taps into like this existing play pattern that's very popular on platforms like Steam, and whether that does trigger, I don't know, maybe some kind of like reflection, like what is it that I'm doing? Why is it like, it's interesting to see an artist kind of like work in the vein of like, oh, this is something that could be like extremely popular, and get people to maybe think more deeply about the hidden networks that allow extremely wealthy people, like through things like the Panama Papers and these offshore accounts, to basically move money from legitimate, basically in and out of illicit and illicit uses. So, or not, I don't know, people just play it like a drug, or just like play it as like a tax kingpin. But that is kind of quietly my hope.
I love a game that could do both. Like I like the idea of thinking about this money laundering simulator as what we in game studies sometimes call serious games. Like it's like a ridiculous game that is it has a kind of serious, like it has an argument, or it has like a way of getting back to dominant strands. So I will be very cool. Yeah.
The other one I was looking at, this was released a little bit earlier this year. It's a game called Defense Contractor Fantasy World. So it was by an artist named Joshua Matson, who's based in Linz in Germany. And this was a single. The game's not out yet, but he released some images of it. You basically hold this like demonic like latex hand to basically play the game. It pulls from some of the like the UI systems from things like SkyKit, these like deployable interfaces. So SkyKit is Palantir produces this. It's basically like War in a box. It's this like deployable big box that you can release on the battlefield, and it gives you all of the data and optics to control autonomous vehicles. And in this instance, you basically use this hand as like a mouse or a cursor, and it jumps back and forth from these kind of like a loadout of like infrastructure of business. It looks kind of like a cookie clicker or universal paper clips, but you're doing it in the service of obviously like, killing lots and lots of people. You know, these idle games I think are super interesting, like as a category. I'm going to talk to Frank Glantz actually next week, a little bit about some of his work, The Beauty of Games. But it was interesting again thinking about Mitch Anzoni's work, to see other game makers maybe deploying some of these mechanics in these sort of like subversive, like these sort of subversive ways. And I think certainly timing wise, we're thinking a lot about autonomous vehicles and thinking a lot about autonomous warfare, certainly as the war in Ukraine drags on, and certainly the way Israel's deployed this with Palestine, and like I think we're thinking a lot about the uses of technology like on the battlefield. So it was interesting to see. It's very interesting to see it deployed in this in a different way. I don't know if he'll release the game. We'll see. I guess I don't know if he'll ship a latex hand or not. But that really jumped out at me. Yeah, yeah, exactly. I would totally play that. One last one. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I was gonna say it's such a promising trend. I think that there's something really beautiful about taking these like, like almost like parasitically attaching to the popularity of a certain kind of gameplay to like inject political messages, like to like, to like do real critical work, not political messages, but to do like forms of critical inquiry inside of these systems, which are like, it's the same game logic that like trains drone pilots, is the one that like, houses thousands of like perverse games on Steam. And so it, like, it's nice that like if more of those Steam games can like speak back to the gamification of the military, the gamification of financial futures, the gamification of like everything has become sort of like gamified. And so like when you get these like game moments that are able to look back at those or like offer a kind of like either like a hyper violence of, we were talking about like Dosper Matrix or the work of like Cruelty Squad, but to like bring out the like the real harms inside of those systems, I think is something really interesting. I want to play this one. I'm glad you brought it up.
Yeah. I mean, I think there was news this week that the U.S. military will be giving 4 days off to play Grand Theft Autos.
Oh my god,
Grand Theft Auto.
Of course. Wow.
I mean, I'm sure if you're a rock star, you're like not don't. Like, not like this. We don't need that. Like, please don't. Like, we're flattered, but please don't. The last one.
Everyone, like, what's the opposite of a military discount? Like, can you have like a military card?
Yeah, tax, exactly. If you see like the defense.gov email address or something like that. Like, anyway, the last one is a little more fun. Step Right Up is I love Wonderville. It's an arcade. It's a physical. I mean, it is a pretty unique. I don't know. I mean, it is a pretty unique space. I'd say even like globally. I mean, so Wonderville is it's a bar, arcade, music venue in Brooklyn, New York. It grew out of the thriving All Control community that was based there, spearheaded by Mark Klebeck and his wife Stephanie. Stephanie Gross. The two of them, she kind of does he does like the front of the house, the arcade games, and I believe she does more of the back of the house, like the biz ops. The two of them have made their life flesh. It grew out of this arcade that I remember when I lived in New York called the Death by Audio Arcade. So it was a music venue called Death by Audio, and then it had this arcade that was kind of attached to it. Death by Audio closed, like many music venues in Williamsburg, New York. But they opened this other place in called Wonderville. It started, I believe, as a Kickstarter project, and it was a little bit kismet with Wonderville. They had a friend whose bar was closing, and so they were able to take over the bar with the liquor license and all that stuff. Anyway, Wonderville is one of the places, I guess, few places in the world that you can go and play new like alternative controller games. These exist, obviously exist in other countries, in Japan, for example, but these are all like independent. It's usually like a one of one. It's like one person has made this one machine and you can only play it in this one place. They have a new game. They don't release that many new games, but they have a new one called Step Right Up. It's a mix of a Zoltar machine, which is like the fortune teller game popularized in Tom Hanks's movie Big, It has vector graphics, which is also like a lovely, this the vector graphics, like that look. It sort of have this like holographic sort of like feel to it. You put your hand on it, and it gives you basically different sort of carnival barker kind of like commands. Lovely little artifact that's only playable in this one place. I hope to get back out to New York to try it. Anyway, I just thought this was just like a nice reminder of like the creativity of building physical things. I wish there were more Wondervilles. It's really hard to operate a space like that.
Yeah.
I think Mark is an electrical engineer by trade, so you really do need someone like on site who can do this. But yeah, it was a nice counterpoint to obviously like the military and money laundering. That was a nice little counterpoint to those kinds of things. Yeah, great, Danny. Always a pleasure. Thank you so much for being with me today. For everybody else, we'll link to all the show notes in the descriptions. A couple things for members. Last week, we had a members-only release for Bruno Abib's Death in August, which is a short film that takes place in and out of the world of GTA, modded GTA San Andreas. But it's about a set of kids living on the outside, basically immigrant communities that are living on the outside of a city in, I believe it's based on some of his childhood experiences based in Lisbon. We also have an extended cut of a game that we've been looking at, Calp Studios. Rahi is the name of the game, which is sort of based on traveler, the word like traveler in Hindi, but it's a game you play as an auto rickshaw driver in a sort of fictionalized version of Goa. But we have both of those for members. Obviously, we love to hear feedback from any of you. If you have any things that you would like to hear about. But aside from that, have a great week. Thank you so much, Danny.
Thank you so much, Jamin. What a pleasure.